to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting to you from Washington, D.C., and it is the 19th of April, Friday, 1 o'clock in the afternoon here in the nation's capital. And we've just had a chaotic night of bombastic news broadcasts and confused alarms. We've had ignorant armies clashing by night, that's for sure, in the Boston area and not only there. And we want to do some justice to the flawed and contradictory accounts of these very suspicious events. But first of all, as always here, the historical perspective that allows us to judge things in their proper light. There are different kinds of terrorist events. Some of them have a direct, pragmatic goal. Some of them are designed to foment a very specific result. You blow up the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor because you want a war with the Spanish Empire, because you want to seize Cuba and the Philippines to make sure Germany doesn't get them. At that time, you stage an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 because you've got a strong faction that wants to have a Vietnam War. And you know the different ones, right? The Gleiwitz radio station is, the attack on it is faked to give Hitler the pretext for the attack on Poland. Even the burning of the Reichstag in the spring of 1933 also has a rather specific goal, although it also has a more general one. But now we have another type, which is prominent in the post-war period. It is not the ad hoc result in this case which counts, but something more diffuse, more generalized, less specific. And I would call this the strategy of tension. It revolves around the use of a series, sometimes of smaller events, to create an atmosphere of precisely of tension in which social movements, protest movements, movements for social change, and so forth can be chilled. They can be isolated. They can be discouraged. They can be fragmented in going into different directions. And it seems to me that there is now accumulating evidence that we are quite possibly in the midst, or maybe in the initial stages, we'll have to see, of a strategy of tension. Let's call it a NATO strategy of tension. Now, the classic example of a NATO strategy of tension came in Italy in December of 1969. And you'll recall that the autumn of 1969 was the greatest trade union mobilization which Italy had seen since 1945. The biggest strike wave since the fall of fascism occurred in the so-called hot autumn of 1969. It may very well have been the biggest strike wave in Europe since the end of the Second World War. Quite possibly it was. And therefore, the problem for NATO ruling circles and for the various Italian banking elites and others was how to deal with this, right? How to suppress such a strike wave, how to abort the potential political consequences, because if that strike wave had been allowed to proceed to some degree of success, it might well have strengthened political parties, the Italian communists, the Italian socialists, the Italian socialists of proletarian unity, and some others that were in the parliament. It might have strengthened them to the point where the notion of Italy leaving NATO might have been a realistic perspective on their part. So the big deal was to prevent it, to cut it off before it got anywhere near there. So the hot autumn was about to turn into winter, and it was around the first 10 days, first 15 days of December in 1969, and bombs were set off in Piazza Fontana in Milan, which is it's close to the State University, and in a bank called the National Agricultural Bank. And I believe 15 or 16 people were killed at the time. Now, in today's world, this would be a terroristic event of the smaller to middle rank, let's say. But in those days, killing 16 people in Europe was considered horrendous. That is the starting point for this event. Now, the thing that we have to point to is whatever the dimensions of the terrorist acts which provides the trigger, the main thing to look at in the strategy of tension is the grossly exaggerated, exorbitant, inordinate response that it seems to be out of all proportion to what's going on. It seems to be the attempt to grip and reorganize the entire society based on terrorist events of at least limited or contained dimensions. And this took a million forms. Whenever the unions, the workers, would come out and try to demonstrate for their economic demands under the cover of the shock and hysteria of the Piazza Fontana bombs of December 1969, the police could come out in force, and they would, for example, if it was Piazza Duomo in Milan, they would fill the square with jeeps and armored vehicles and God knows what, and drive them all around and try to run down the workers, right? Drive them out of the square using these motorized vehicles is the way to do that. The police then sent patrols into the university. They'd go into a lecture and they'd say, "What's going on here?" And the professor would say, "Well, I'm teaching my class." And the cops would say, "Yes, but it's a class of terrorism. We know you." At the airport, people were being harassed, God knows, beaten up, frisked, stopped, thrown to the ground, bags confiscated, God knows what. So it was a vast panorama of hysteria. Perhaps we can see some distant mirror in it for our own recent past. Hysteria, overreaction, the deliberate creation of spectacle, starting again from whatever the initial dimensions of the terrorist action were. Now, of course, who did it? Before too long, an anarchist was blamed, right? It was the Bakunin Club, and the male dancer Valpreda was blamed, and Pinelli, the worker riding on a bicycle, was taken to the police headquarters and was apparently tossed off a balcony on the second or third floor and lost his life that way. And, of course, it turns out that what was behind this were Freda and Ventura, meaning the wind rose, the compass card, the Rosa dei Venti, which was essentially an emanation of NATO of Vicenza, NATO of Verona. The NATO bases in northeast Italy were the actual emanation of these events, not the Bakunin Club, who were simply useful idiots and patsies. So we have to watch out for events which are manufactured and then useful idiots, patsies, who can take the fall. Of course, once you've looked at this model of Italy 1969-1970, the successful breaking of a strike wave, you'd have to ask yourself, is anything similar going on in the United States right now? I would point really to two things, and we'll try to discuss them during the course of the program. The first is that we could have mass resistance against the main fronts, right? The main front right now is opposition to austerity, stop the killer cuts, stop genocidal austerity against the American people. That is the one issue where a majority mass movement is possible. It's eminently feasible. 80 to 90% of the American people demand their rights under Social Security and Medicare. They have paid into those programs all their life. They own those programs. That is their personal property just as much as a piece of land or a car or a boat or anything else. They own those pensions. They own that medical insurance. anybody tampering with that does so at extreme political risk. And that is the thing that has to be understood. Remember, it's possible to organize around a foreign war, but you will never get anywhere near taking a piece of power. That is the lesson of the 60s and the 70s. And, of course, organizing around a false flag may be attractive to some, but with the biggest one of the age, 9/11, it proved impossible to organize a mass movement. And ultimately, ironically, it even seemed to carry water to the mill of scoundrels like Ron Paul, Rand Paul, and this libertarian canaille, what can we call them, this human dust that use these events to suck people in for their absolutely destructive economic plans. So the way you're going to get somewhere politically is to keep your eyes on the prize. Don't let the enemy impose his will on you. Don't be diverted by events like this. And again, it means don't say, forget about Social Security and Medicare. We're going to gather 20,000 signatures to get an investigation of something or other. Forget it. It's pointless. Things are much, much too far gone for that kind of thing. Rather, keep up your activity, and let's teach by example. The United Front Against Austerity, UFAA, the United Front Against Austerity will be at Farragut West on Saturday, the 20th of April at about noon. This was a demonstration that was originally set for Morrow Park over by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and so forth, but this is now going to be moved back towards Farragut Park. That's a great place, right? Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, watching over you, and get some agitation on the scoreboard with that. There's also an intervention by the United Front Against Austerity, UFAA, in a conference being held in the New York area. I'm sure you can look at this up. The group Jobs for All, the neo-Trotskyist Jobs for All, is having a joint meeting, I guess, with the eco-socialists, the eco-socialists. So that is not in itself, well, it is what it is, but we're going to hope that the real positive programmatic content is going to be provided by the United Front Against Austerity, including prods to make Jobs for All in particular think about the tremendous holes in their program. Right? What do they have to say about the Federal Reserve? What's the role of the Federal Reserve in organizing a recovery? Does everything have to be through the federal budget so that it becomes debt for the American people? Why not use that credit-creating power in the Federal Reserve and use that to create 30 million new jobs? So this kind of thing. Keep your eyes on these issues. This is where the decision will be fought. So again, different kinds of terrorism, right? Gulf of Tonkin, blowing up of the Maine, things like this. It's a very specific result. And in those cases, and 9/11, of course, the greatest of all, right? To get the Iraq, Afghanistan wars, the war of civilization, more generally, right? 7 or 8 years of foreign policy growing out of the 9/11 events. Was indispensable. During the time of the Iraq War, the only way to oppose the Iraq War was to refute the lie of 9/11, the Bush theory of 9/11, and the official version had to be refuted. Now, in this case, it is much more diffuse, and I believe we can say after the past week that whatever the first event is, it will quickly be overtaken by more events, and it's really already happened. We've had these Boston Marathon bombs on Monday, and then we've had these ricin poisoned letters going to the White House and a Mississippi senator. And those are two separate events, according to the FBI. Now, we might well feel that they're more related than these official statements are willing to admit. But you get the idea. These are supposedly separate, and, who knows what will be next. the goal of this is nothing so specific. It's, might even say, it's not so much to make something happen, it's to make something not happen. It is supposed to make sure that the resistance against killer austerity and genocidal cuts, the resistance against a war with Syria, to make sure that those are suppressed, to try to paralyze mass protest movements. And anybody who's got a demonstration scheduled should keep it up and stick to your original topic, and don't just turn it around into some kind of caterwauling about some event in Boston or anywhere else. And you've got to have a sense of moral proportions in these questions, right? These terrorist events can kill individuals, they can kill tens, they even get into the hundreds, rarely into the thousands. But when you're talking about killer cuts, genocidal austerity in the social safety net, you're in the area of economic crimes, and the immediate morbidity, mortality goes into the hundreds of thousands and indeed the millions, and perhaps even more, because if you get into the destruction of U.S. food aid, which is now a convergence between Obama and people like little Rand Paul, they're talking about ending or severely scaling back U.S. food aid. Now you're talking about half of the emergency food aid in the world. You're talking about millions and millions, maybe tens of millions of potential victims over not too long a time. So these are the general ideas. Let me also just a parable, if you will, from, 30 years ago already. I happened to be in the spring of 1983. So it's 30 years ago, right around this time of year, the end of April and the first day or two of May, in Warsaw, Poland. This was part of the Warsaw Pact. The visit occurred in activity and developments such as the past week, and I'm afraid the period ahead, as we seem to be going deeper into a strategy of tension, a typical NATO strategy of tension, targeting the resistance to austerity, seeking to sweep away the resistance to austerity, to chill it, to paralyze it, to otherwise render it ineffective, and then quite possibly to mask. This is quite different than Bush, right? To mask the coming of the attack on Syria, where we have any number of rather large institutional events in the past few days. Let me just tell you the story of my conversation with Konopatsky. Konopatsky was the spokesman of General Jaruzelski's martial law regime in Warsaw, Poland, 30 years ago, and being there as a journalist for U.S. small circulation news magazine, I went and talked to Konopatsky, and Konopatsky said, first thing you have to know is that the situation of the elite circles and opinion leaders in Warsaw right now is calm. It was, once again, towards the end of April 1983, just about 30 years ago right now. So he said, the situation is calm. He said, but it's possible to have rapid changes. Now, remember, this is Poland, right? They had been under the Soviet occupation since 1944-45. They had an upturn in a rebellion, I guess, in Poznan and a few other places in 1956 at the time of the Hungarian rebellion. And on the other hand, after that, some strikes, nothing that big. They were, of course, moving towards something quite large as we got towards the end of the 80s, and indeed the collapse of the regime that Konopatsky represented. But he said his job was to monitor the mood, the immediate subjective psychological situation of elite circles, opinion leaders, key organizers, key agitators in the Polish capital of Warsaw. And he said, look, this place can change very rapidly. It's like any place else in the world, but maybe a little bit more so. He said, in the winter, the changes are often depressive. They're often towards more inertia, less action, but not always. Sometimes a surprise upturn, a surprise outburst can appear in the winter months. But he said the typical time for a mass upsurge is the spring, and then as you go into the summer. But above all, the spring, he said. So I monitor those circles, and I can tell you right now they're calm, but we are, extremely vigilant. Now, I'm just telling you this story. Nothing so special about this. Every government does it. Every government does it, and above all, every banking community does it, because otherwise, if the bankers don't monitor those things on their own with their own private intelligence, how would they know how to direct the governments to do what they want, right? They have to have the forces above and behind the White House, above and behind the Oval Office, have to know what they want to do. I was down in Washington, D.C. the other day. I saw a first labor protest in a long, long time. It was the drywall guys. It was people who were protesting at a site where drywall was being installed, and it was not being done according to the union rules. And this was, I believe, the Carpenters Union and some other unions were together. So there was a picket line. First time in a very, very long time. So what do I know? On the other hand, it's perfectly possible. You look at Obama, right? He's in the midst now of a hard right turn. A hard right turn by Obama, right? We've now got drones. We've got, looks like an intervention, an attack on Syria coming up soon. We've got, the regime says they can kill anybody they want. The regime says they can jail anybody they want with no due process. The regime now says they're going to cut your Social Security pension and take away your Medicare benefits. And, of course, that's just the opening salvo, because if you can defeat the well-organized seniors and that well-organized political phenomenon around that, you can basically tear up anything you want, right? The benefits for children, mothers, students, young people, working families, and all that, those can easily be shredded if you can do the Medicare and Medicaid, Medicare and Social Security actually first. So I think, again, this is perhaps what's going on. Now, let's just look at this Boston stuff. The problem with it is, first of all, many contradictions, many problems. At the beginning, we were told that there were trash cans and that the bombs were in trash cans. That still may have been the case. We're told that at the finish line, there were lots and lots of sniffer dogs, policemen, members of the National Guard, and so forth. Nevertheless, all of that security, that overreaching security, turned out to be perfectly useless. It was easy to come in and set down packages either on the street, as some photographs suggest, or in these trash cans. If you go down to downtown Washington, D.C., you cannot find a letterbox. You cannot find a post box, and you cannot find a trash can. And that, I think, is probably the case in quite a few large cities. And at the beginning, of course, we were told there was a Saudi suspect, that he had been tackled by some person with, I don't know what, the vigilante spirit animating him. The guy was tackled, and then he's going to be expelled from the country. And the reactionaries were rooting all the time for this to be a Muslim from the Middle East, so that they could then start beating the drum for war. And I think in that sense, perfectly legitimate for people to say, gee, I hope it's not that, because then the neocons will have their pretext for another war. On the other hand, if it had turned out to be, a bomber from North Korea or a bomber from Syria, but maybe a bomber from Iran, then we would have known very clearly what was going on, would we not? So we were also told that there was a simultaneous fire at the Kennedy Library. That turned out to be, I don't know what. These things all pop up and then they disappear from the narrative. We were told that there were 2 other suspicious packages Was one of those the Kennedy Library or not? We're told it's the first bombing in the United States since 2001. Is that actually true? Most interesting, right? With this huge multi-hundred-billion-dollar anti-terror apparatus, right? With every Beltway bandit trying to cash in, getting a Homeland Security contract to anchor his line. We were told then, no warning, no chatter, no suspects, and for quite a few days, no suspects, no arrest. All I think, strange. Now, one interesting contribution, which I think perhaps is worth mentioning, a number of members of Congress on the first couple of days. Representative Peter King is a kind of liberal reactionary Republican from the New York area. He said the cuts to the police have gone too far. Now, there is a real-world argument. The sequester and all of those cuts of the last 3 years, right? You're cutting firemen, you're cutting teachers, you're cutting health workers, you're cutting state employees. Surprise, you're also cutting police. And surprise, when you cut them, it has an effect. The reactionary thesis, of course, is you can cut anything you want as much as you want, and there is no real-world effect because they don't do anything anyway. Well, maybe in, of course, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Now, we're told that this is at the time I'm speaking now in the afternoon, the news reports say, and I guess we have to refer to them, one patsy killed. That is Tamerlane of these two brothers, the one of the two whose photographs had been shown on Thursday. And then the other one, Jokar, is on the run, right? He's a fugitive. And, the first thing to say about this is shutting down the entire city of Boston, shutting down the entire subway system, banning traffic. Does this make sense? What are the possible losses of life for people who can't get to hospitals, for people who can't get to things like kidney dialysis or medical appointments or things like this, right? Have we lost all sense of proportion? You're responding to what is, again, a terrorist episode of strictly limited dimensions, to go no further than that. And instead, the entire city of Boston has to come to a halt. What are the morbidity, mortality implications of that? Was that weighed at all? We're told that the police drive buses up to communities, tell people, get in the bus, we're deporting you. You're going to be deported out of your neighborhood. Well, that doesn't look so good. Is that really necessary? And we've got armored vehicles in Watertown, Massachusetts, armored vehicles on the streets of Cambridge. The entire metropolitan area of Boston paralyzed. Does that make sense? Is that not a loss of all sense of proportion? The other thing about it is, if you are in the mindset of these authorities, whoever they are, you have to ask yourself, are you not letting the enemy impose his will on you? If you consider these terrorists the enemy, then you are letting the enemy impose his will on you to a rather remarkable degree. The other question I have is, who orders these things? You see this Deval Patrick, right? This he seems to come out of the same general political tendency as Obama, and Deval Patrick seems to be standing around and taking part when the decisions are announced. But it's not like he gets up there and says, "I have announced, I am ordering." Where is power at this point, right? This is the old question from Carl Schmitt, is where in the government can you declare martial law? Because the point where martial law can be declared is where power actually resides. So I'd like to know who is making these decisions for Boston and for Massachusetts. Is it the FBI? Is it some member of the state police? Is it local cops? Who is doing this? Who makes these decisions? To whom are they accountable? What is the length of this going to be? And then inevitably we get to Chechnya, and once we've got Chechnya, I'm afraid we're in the area. It's one of the most densely populated areas in terms of secret intelligence agencies of anybody in the world. And I would basically posit right now as a general approach, right, because the details are now fragmentary and still coming out. Once you're talking Chechens, and Chechens allowed to come to the United States in the last 10 years, which seems to be the case for Tamerlane and for Dzhokhar, the two brothers, you're talking about Chechens of a special type that are acceptable to the United States. And at that point, I'm afraid we have lots of questions for the CIA at that point, because, these leading Chechens, right? Basayev, I think Basayev, I believe, has been eliminated over the course of the years, but the essential word was that Basayev was a notorious CIA agent. Basayev was one of the top leaders of the Chechen rebels, and he seemed to be reporting pretty closely to the CIA. Aslan Maskadov, another Chechen rebel leader, along with Basayev, we have Aslan Maskadov, also reputed to be from the orbit of U.S. intelligence. And then the other one, the current one, I guess, is Doku Umarov, who is regarded by the Russian Federation as one of their public enemies, number one. But there can be no doubt that these terrorist organizations are pervaded by U.S. intelligence agency influence. And let me just go back, right? September 2004, less than a decade ago, the attack on the school in Beslan, North Ossetia, this was done by people claiming to be from the Chechen liberation movement, the Chechen terrorist movement. And on Monday, September 6th, 2004, Russian President Vladimir Putin went to his dacha near Novo-Ogoryevo outside Moscow. He had 30 Western correspondents. This was blacked out in the U.S. press, but not the Europeans. The French and some others had it. And here's what Putin said about these Chechen rebels. He said certain Western political circles would like to weaken Russia, just as the Romans wanted to destroy Carthage. So you beat us in the Cold War, but now you want to dismember the Russian Federation, right? Punic Wars, end of them, 146 BC. The Romans poured salt into the ground at Carthage, so nothing would grow for a very, very long time. So Putin said, the aim of this international terrorism, supported more or less openly by foreign states, that means U.S. and British above all, supported more or less openly by foreign states, whose names the Russian president does not want to name, is to weaken Russia from the inside by criminalizing its economy, by provoking its disintegration through propagating separatism in the Caucasus and the transformation of the region into a place d'armes, a staging area, military staging ground for actions directed against the Russian Federation. Mr. Putin, according to the Le Monde version of this conversation, September 2004, Mr. Putin restated the accusation that he had launched in a veiled form against Western countries, which appeared to him to use double talk. On the one side, their leaders assured the Russian president of their solidarity in the fight against terrorism. On the other hand, the intelligence services and the military have kept their Cold War prejudices, and they maintain contacts with those called rebels. Right? Of course, terrorists, right? The Chechen terrorists. And Putin asks, why are those who emulate bin Laden called terrorists and the people who kill children called rebels? Where is the logic? You get the idea. And then he says, this is a mistake, says Putin. Right? It's worse than a crime. It's a mistake. This is, according to Putin, a bad calculation because Russia is a factor of stability. By weakening Russia, the Cold War nostalgics in the West are clearly acting against the interests of their own country. We are, and then Putin says, we, Russia, are the sincere champions of this cooperation against terrorism. We are open and loyal partners. But if foreign services have contact with the Chechen rebels, they cannot be treated as reliable allies as Russia is for them. And he's told, if they tell me to talk to Maskadov, I say, why don't you invite bin Laden to the White House and talk to him there? Now, that is what the Chechen rebel movement. This radio, Webster G. Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. Now, the material that I've just been sharing with you, Putin's comments on the Chechen terrorist movement, right? The Chechen terrorist movement backed by the CIA, MI6, NATO intelligence in general, as he said in that famous meeting with journalists at his dacha in September of 2004. That is all from 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in USA, the landmark book. And in particular, it's from the 4th edition. If you want to get all of that, I know for sure it's in the 4th edition. The other editions, I'll have to check. So if you have the 4th edition, you find it. If you have another edition, you may not find it. So get the 4th edition. There's a whole chapter in there about Chechen terrorism. But, of course, not just 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in USA, that you have to have. Here I've got my Obama, the Postmodern Coup, the Making of a Manchurian Candidate. What do we find here? Here's an interesting chapter on page 95 of the edition with the black cover. What do we find? Obama campaign linked to Chechen terrorism. And the headline, grant of taxpayer-funded U.S. asylum for Chechen terror envoy gave Obama foreign policy guru Zbigniew Brzezinski one of the happiest days of my life. And it starts off, this is February 2nd, 2008. If the American public were generally aware that the foreign minister of one of the most murderous terrorist organizations in the world, a man whose extradition on terrorist charges is sought by at least one permanent member of the UN Security Council, this man living openly in Washington, D.C., they would probably be indignant if the Americans knew that this is the foreign minister of a terrorist group specializing in killing women and children in a hospital, in a school, in a theater. Chechens did all that. Their indignation might now grow into rage if they knew that this envoy for terrorists is living in the comfortable Woodley Park neighborhood of Washington, D.C., with a lifestyle that most Americans could not afford, with an office, a secretary, a travel budget, and a public relations budget, all paid for by you, the U.S. taxpayer, with the State Department check signed by Condoleezza Rice. They might be furious. And, of course, this is the story of Ilyas Khamzatovich Akhmadov. He is the permanent Chechen, or was at this time, the permanent Chechen envoy to the United States. So, as the article says, these infamous killers, right? The terrorist organization in question is the Chechen rebel group associated with the names of two of the greatest butchers of our time, Aslan Maskadov and Shamil Basayev, both deceased, even though the organization they built fights on. That's this Doku Umarov. And the foreign minister is Ilyas Akhmadov. And this article then tells the story of how he was granted not just permanent residency, but official status, and indeed a U.S. government pension support. And one of the professors who looked into that, right, this is published in Johnson's Russia List, March 20th, 2005. Professor Robert Ware writes, he's polemicizing with Zbigniew Brzezinski. Here's what Professor Ware says. If 9/11 made bin Laden a terrorist, and if the Oklahoma City blast made McVeigh a terrorist, then why did not public acceptance of responsibility for the Ingushetia raids, this is down there in that area, Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, and so forth, why did public acceptance of those raids, of his accepting responsibility, make Aslan Maskadov a terrorist? If Maskadov is a terrorist, then what about those who represent him, such as Ilyas Akhmadov? And does it make Ilyas Akhmadov, living in Washington, D.C. then and probably now, a terrorist when he is enjoying political asylum and prestigious professional position at the expense of the U.S. taxpayer? Akhmadov should be asked to leave the United States as soon as possible. So what does the Obama regime have to say about their opening the doors to these Chechen representatives of groups that are regarded by some countries as terrorists, and they obviously have a case? Well, what do we conclude about that, right? Is there anything relevant there? So all of this, these are all things we have to look into. In the meantime, get yourself Obama, the Postmodern Coup. You'll get the whole story of the Obama campaign and the Chechens, and for the Putin characterizations of the Beslan school massacre and what he had to say about the Chechen terrorist movement. 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA, especially the fourth edition, has that in some detail. And then, of course, this whole thing has other aspects, right? Why are you robbing a convenience store in the middle of the night? It's just mind-boggling. Why are you trying to steal a car? Couldn't you get a car in advance so you wouldn't have to steal one? Not that hard to do. Very, very hard to understand. So pessimism overtakes the West as a result of these horrible events, because again, it's not just the bombing on the Monday. Then we got the ricin, the letters laced with terrorism, with these poisons going to the Congress and the White House. And then at the end of the week, we've got the shootouts, the hand grenades, we're told. We have to wait for the smoke to clear to get any of these details. The family accused, right? There's a sister somewhere. There's an uncle close here to Washington in Montgomery Village, Maryland, and he claims to have nothing to do with it. He actually, the uncle's line was, some people are able to assimilate, settle themselves into a new country, and some of them can't, and the ones who can't then have resentments against those who can. I don't know. Anyway, all very suspicious, but remember, the bottom line of all of this is precisely not to make this the central issue, because it's not. For hundreds of millions of people, the issues are what we've been saying. How do I stop a foreclosure on my house? How do I get medical care for my sick wife? My kid needs tuition paid. What do I do? Medicare for all, the student loan amnesty, the overall freeze on foreclosures, how to make Wall Street pay for the crisis, how to beat back these attacks on the social safety net, and indeed, how to rehire a lot of teachers, firemen, and policemen that might have had some effect in this case. Although, again, it looks like there's some machinations involved. And then again, step back. On the one side, the austerity. On the other side, the Syrian war. Let me just also, though, say something about the sadness of the timing. there's actually an element of suspicion. Right? This is not just any time of the year. The timing of the Boston Marathon has to do with Patriots' Day. Patriots' Day has to do with the Paul Revere's ride, and then the day after the battles of Lexington and Concord. So as coincidence would have it, or as something other than coincidence would have it, in Cambridge, this area, this is the anniversary of Paul Revere. And you'll remember the famous lines from Longfellow. They are worth remembering. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. So Paul Revere has a friend. They're going to have the famous coded signal. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. And then Paul Revere's got to get himself across Boston Harbor in a rowboat, passing the Somerset, the British man of war, looking at the moon, and then his friend gets up to the Tower of Old North Church. It's 2 because they're coming by sea, so he's riding then through Middlesex County and these areas. He gets to Medford by noon. He gets to Concord he gets to Lexington by 1 a.m., to Concord by 2 a.m., and as he does it, and yet, through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night. And finally, this was written by Longfellow in 1860, so it's on the verge of the Civil War. And you can see that the Civil War was coming. So here, I think, is the part of it that speaks directly to us. And remember, the cause of civilization in this part of the world has to be maintained against barbarism, against machinations, false flags, whatever may emerge from this. And it doesn't look good, does it? So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Now, I'm not talking about mechanistic repetition, but I'm saying it would seem this strategy of tension takes us to the brink of a qualitative deterioration of the world crisis, and it's time to mobilize politically. Smart politics is what we need right now. And, of course, the next day, it's Lexington and Concord. We've just heard Longfellow's Ride of Paul Revere, worth teaching to your kids. And then the Concord Hymn by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, we don't like Ralph Waldo Emerson, but even people who are mediocre or bad sometimes have a little poetry of some merit. And this is the famous one, by the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. And those were the famous Latin farmers. Those were highly educated, culturally advanced people. So don't fixate on the guns, fixate on their cultural advances, right? These were people who before too long were talking about written constitutions, no king, natural rights anchored in a constitution, all very good things, and all of them revolutionary then and to a significant degree revolutionary now. All right, so that's our situation, and it's an appeal that today, right, we are in some kind of situation, the hour of darkness and peril and need. You can find similar language in the short story "The Gray Champion" by Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Twice Told Tales. All right, so let's look at where we stand. Otherwise, the main thing, of course, is austerity. However, we've talked about that. We'll do Syria first. We've got any number of empirical pointers piling up that something is going to happen vis-a-vis Syria. Now, it's not the first time, but on the other hand, it is spring. It's time. The military campaigning season is on. The winter rains of the Mediterranean have drifted away, so now you can do things militarily you couldn't do in the midst of the Mediterranean winter rains on the Mediterranean coast and so forth. So here's what we have. Chuck Hagel, oh gosh, he was supposed to be a peace hero, wasn't he, to some of them? He is sending 200 highly trained troops to Jordan. Now, when I look at that group of 200, I'd have to say, what is that? Is that a headquarters of a division? Is that the headquarters of an expeditionary force? That looks to me like a headquarters of a larger force. And they're being sent ahead to Jordan. 200 additional U.S. troops to Jordan. On the day after the bombing, I believe, we had the meeting of the Saudi foreign minister, Saud al-Faisal, with Obama at the White House. Saud al-Faisal, foreign minister, Saudi Arabia, apparently the longest serving, right? This guy that he was in my class in college. We never saw him. He was always skiing in Switzerland and never knew anybody who knew him, but he graduated with that class. Saud al-Faisal was supposed to meet with Donelan, right, the head of the National Security Council there, top advisor to Obama, whatever he is. And Obama dropped in. So this is apparently about Syria. This is the attack on Syria. Faisal pressing for it. Obama perhaps giving him finally what he wants. So Hagel is sending the headquarters of a division. Netanyahu says he has to prevent Syrian weapons from falling into the wrong hands. We're talking about surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. We're talking about chemical weapons. Netanyahu says this is a big deal. Those are game changers. Netanyahu reserves the right to invade. He says that there are now Islamists armed with fairly sophisticated weapons along the Israeli border at the Golan. He wants to arm foreign insurgents going into Syria, but he concedes it's complicated. He's got to coordinate U.S., Jordan, Turkey, and presumably also Lebanon and the Kurds. And then the other one is Ban Ki-moon goes to the Pentagon. We'll do that one in a minute, and that will be, isn't that going to be a boomerang? Isn't there going to be a blowback there, BB? We've got Hagel saying that a 200-person team of the U.S. military is going to Jordan. That looks like a headquarters, the leading edge of, you remember when the Soviets went into Afghanistan, they had their headquarters in an airplane, right, so that they could run the whole headquarters out of a large transport plane that landed on one of the runways of one of the airports. Then we've got Kerry saying that Obama will not be constrained by diplomacy. He's going to attack when he wants. In other words, forget the UN Security Council. Obama meets Saud al-Faisal, obviously pressing him for the attack on Syria. Now, concerning Ban Ki-moon, we're told, is being pressed by the British and the French, by Cameron and Haig, and by Hollande and Fabius. Fabius now a 6 million euro man, a plutocrat, but they're all saying, oh, come on, there's plenty of proof that the Syrian government is using chemical weapons, and that's going to be the key thing. That's what Netanyahu talks about. That's Barkey's red line. So that is what we're hearing, that the British and the French are saying that they have abundant proof that the Syrian government is using these chemical weapons against the death squad rebels. Well, Assad said it earlier in the week. If the U.S. and NATO and the British and so forth, the Israelis, go through with this, they're going to pay a terrible price. And it's going to be a terrible price in terms of making the Mediterranean into a terrorist lake. Between Syria and Libya, that's enough to make at least the eastern Mediterranean into a terrorist, central and eastern Mediterranean into a terrorist lake. And they'll be followed then by others that will tip situations in Tunisia, maybe even Egypt, who knows, Lebanon, and so forth. And then for the individual politicians, right, we've just tried to suggest that the prominence of Chechens now in the United States, Chechens have not gotten a lot of attention, but now they're getting it after this Boston event. Well, wait a minute. What about the Obama campaign of 2008? And they're playing footsie, their softness on Chechen terrorists as part of their overall color revolution strategy. So that's all in Obama, the postmodern coup, the making of the Manchurian Candidate, Obama soft on Chechen terrorism, and then somebody might say, well, that's impeachable now that that's turned into a terrorist action here. So all of that swirling around Syria. Now, let's just remind ourselves also, the budget, Obama's budget, which for the first time in writing, we have a Democratic president proposing to attack the two main middle-class mass support pillars of the social safety net, of the New Deal, Great Society, and New Frontier reforms. That was sent on Tuesday. The budget went to Congress on Tuesday, and Obama says he wants to preserve entitlements. But Obama's tactic now is to play one generation against the other. He says, well, the current setup spends too much on old people, not enough on young people. And this is bait for fools because, again, it doesn't work that way. It's a constituency for a social safety net in general or not. And once you begin splitting, once you accept that, then you are lost. Everybody's lost. I've argued repeatedly now that Social Security, Medicare have incomparably the strongest support base. The AARP, the unions, all kinds of other organizations. We saw them at the White House on the during the previous week. I wrote an article trying to mention them, right? Trying to honor each one of them with a mention. If you can defeat that kind of organized power, you can defeat anything. There's nothing that's fighting for Head Start or WIC or S-CHIP or even food stamps or unemployment benefits that has the same power. It's just not comparable. So if you say we're gonna slash the oldies and then redistribute that to the others, you're kidding yourself. That will be redistributed to Wall Street. And indeed, Obama is calling for a cut in the federal corporate income tax. Obama says that 35% is too much, but they don't pay it, Obama. You should be calling for the enforcement of 35%, not saying on the one hand, I want to cut the corporate income tax, and then on the other saying, I'm going to gouge and chisel the benefits of old people, sick people, and so forth. And remember, let's just look at the mass impact of this. There are 39 million Social Security recipients. So this is an old age pension you can get on a limited basis starting at 62, full basis starting at 67, again, depending on when you were born. But there are people who are disabled. They can't work. They get Social Security. Survivors get it. Widows, widowers, and orphans can get Social Security, but the same consumer price index, right, the same so-called CPIW that is used to calculate the cost of living increases of Social Security for old age, disabled, survivors, widows, orphans, widowers, and the disabled. All of that is also used to calculate the benefits for approximately, I think it's 3.2 million disabled veterans who also receive Social Security before the age of 62. So they're too young to get the benefit, but they're going to get it, but Obama is going to chisel them. The amount of chiseling is estimated to be, if they simply enact the chain CPI, they will chisel $220 billion over 10 years, $22 billion a year, but precisely from the people that are going to be hurt most by this. If certain fig leaf protections for the most vulnerable are built in, it'll be $130 billion in chiseling over a 10-year period. Now, just in terms of the technicalities, what they're proposing to do is to take the current consumer price index W, that is, there are several consumer price indices that are elaborated by the U.S. Department of Labor. The one that is used for these cost of living adjustments in Social Security and the veterans benefits is the CPIW, that is, urban wage earners and clerical workers. It contains 211 categories of goods and services. This is already skewed. Boskin, as we've been denouncing for weeks, Michael Boskin, the dilettante, the charlatan, fake economist, came in 1996. He had been chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for Mad Dog Bush the Elder, and he came in, remember the famous line, he said, well, I can get Chablis and Brie at my local deli, so that means inflation is less than you claim, right? Just insane, anecdotal, stupid, banal, but also class-based Chablis and Brie, right? Boskin already skewed, distorted, tampered with this index, and now they want to do a second round. So they want to go from the CPIW to the chained or superlative, some of them even say superlative consumer price index. Notice that the buying patterns of urban wage earners and clerical workers are not the same as old people. Old people spend more on medicine, more on health care. Democrat, naturally, the Ryan budget is privatize Social Security, voucherize Medicare, euthanize the elderly, and vaporize the social safety net in general. It is 3.2 million disabled veterans, in addition to 39 million senior citizens of all types, get these pensions. These are the ones Obama wants to gouge. The chain CPI will hit the oldest and the poorest and women. At age 92, if you've been on Social Security since the mid-60s, you will lose 1 full month of benefits per year. So it hits the oldest, the poorest, women, the neediest. Remember, poverty is still highest for old people compared to other groups. 9% of poverty, older people are below the poverty line. 5.7% are near poor. That's 15%. Actually, children have more poverty, but this is already something to deal with. So we're not interested in fighting over a shrinking pie. We want to attack Wall Street and increase the pie and be able to have decent, humane conditions for all. Now, Robert Reich has at least this useful idea. Rather than go through this complex chain CPI, this flim-flam, lift the cap. Lift the cap means at the present time, you can only be taxed on income up to $13,700. You're going to pay Social Security payroll tax, right? FICA, F-I-C-A, payroll tax. It only is collected up to $113,700 of income. Why? Lift the cap. No cap. Sky's the limit. All the way up. You earn it, you're going to pay Social Security payroll tax on it. That's whether you're hired, whether you're a formally hired employee, or whether you're a contractor. So, and then, of course, the broader solution, the 1% Wall Street sales tax. Now, before all this brouhaha got going, 1:15 Monday afternoon, Limbaugh, at his Institute of Retarded Reactionary Ranting, had taken the day off, and he called in some Hollywood actor, I believe, I don't know who he is, Doug Urbanski. And Doug Urbanski, in his rants, was starting to attack what he called the financial transfer tax or financial transaction tax. He started to attack this. He said, oh, my God, they're taxing everything. Will it never stop? Now they're even proposing to tax Wall Street trading. And gosh, all of a sudden, he dropped that like a hot potato. It was 1:15 on Monday afternoon. The Boston events did not occur for almost 2 hours after this. They were at least not known until 2 hours after this. So something's going on, right? So this reached into the ragbag mind of Doug Urbanski, and I can imagine that guy Snerdley that Limbaugh has telling him what to say. They told him, drop that theme, because the whole defense against the Wall Street sales tax, the main defense is that Joe Sixpack does not realize that Wall Street pays no taxes. They pay between 0 and 5% corporate income tax, not the 35% that are mandated, and they pay almost nothing. They pay absolutely nothing in terms of the turnover tax. There is that tiny, tiny microscopic tax which funds the Securities and Exchange Commission. So they pay, again, almost nothing, right? It's asymptotically converging on nothing. Now, we got these events coming up on the weekend. We're going to be United Front Against Austerity is going to be out there in Washington at Farragut West on Saturday around noon. And there's also this the meeting, the Jobs for All and the Eco-Socialists. So we want to have a vigorous discussion. We started with Jobs for All back in October at our meeting in Walker Street in New York. And remember, the Jobs for All is a group that says they want to create 25 million jobs directly on the federal budget, paid for by the U.S. Treasury. They want to pay for this through a tax on wealth that is not income, but assets, the wealth that you have accumulated over time. And they want all of this to be directed through local control, autogestion, and the self-management, I guess they call it. So let's ask a few questions about this. First of all, how can you have an economic program that doesn't start with the Federal Reserve? You got to do something with the Federal Reserve, right? Some say the loony bird, the chuckleheads, and the wacko birds on the libertarian fringe say, "Oh, end the Fed, end the Fed." No. We are going to seize control of the Federal Reserve. We're going to nationalize it, federalize it, deprivatize it, refederalize it. That's the richest part of the government. That's where credit can be created. You can create all the money you need out of nothing. All you got to do is know how to channel it into purely productive activity, plant and equipment, jobs, production, raw materials, and so forth. So maybe the problem is that Leon Trotsky doesn't seem to have anything to say about the Federal Reserve. I'm also guessing that Keynes does not directly address the way in which the Federal Reserve or a central bank could directly through credit stimulus, not hot money, not anything like that, but directly through credit stimulus. This is the so-called group that is, I think, wrongly, but sometimes referred to as the German pre-Keynesians. That is Wilhelm Lautenbach. We've talked about him in the German finance ministry, and W.S. Wojcinski at the German trade unions. Those are the two leading, and there are some others around Lautenbach and a group of others. They all want the same thing. They want the German central bank to cough up several billion in credits for infrastructure production. But Trotsky doesn't seem to respond to this, and neither does Keynes that I know of anyway. I'd be interested if people know that, if they know where Keynes says something about that interesting and indeed vital topic. It would be great if Keynes had said, yeah, use credit stimulus to get a recovery, but I don't think he did. So what's the proposal to use the inherent credit-creating power of the central bank for job creation in the area of modern infrastructure, but then all across the productive spectrum, from agriculture to mining to industry, energy production, scientific research, in our day, space travel, and so forth? Now, the other problem is the Jobs for All group. They want 25 million jobs on the federal budget. Now, what's that going to cost? I get the impression that they're looking at jobs with very low capital expenditure, capital investment per job. You need substantial capital investment per job, right? The cheapest is if I give you a $5 rake and so say go rake leaves, then that's a $5 capital investment per job. It's got to be in the hundreds. It's got to be in the millions, just, clearly. But if you just take 25 million jobs and you put them on the federal budget, suppose each job, when you count wages, benefits, and some kind of capital investment of some sort, suppose it's $100,000 per job. That's very low. But if it's 25 million jobs, there you go with $2.5 trillion more deficit. So if the existing deficit is $1 trillion, give or take, that gets you up to $3.5 trillion in deficit per year. Now, is that sustainable indefinitely? Some say yes. I think in today's world, with credit default swaps, rating agencies, and so forth, it's going to be very hard to do that. And if interest rates go up even slightly, then the debt service will begin to eat just about the entire budget. Now, the Jobs for All people say they want to put a tax on wealth. Very quickly, suppose the total assets of individuals in the U.S. is $100 trillion. If it's a 1% wealth tax, that gives you $1 trillion, but you're still dealing with a $2.5 trillion deficit. So isn't it better to use the Wall Street sales tax to stabilize the federal and state budgets and then seize control over the Fed and use that federal lending, not federal spending,